Mike says, "Hi, Rob. Love the work that you're doing. Very much appreciated. I ran into a guy by the name of Kiefer who is emerging as a big presence of what might seem to be a growing following known as carb backloading. I just wanted your thoughts on this diet protocol and whether or not you think this growth will continue or if the science just doesn't add up and the broad masses will eventually figure that out. Thanks for your feedback, Mike." Why is it all about women? The broad masses? It's rude.
Dude, it's so sexist. Kiefer's a really sharp guy. He's shot me some emails. We're going to get him on the podcast at some point. We're going to get Nate Mayaki on the podcast here pretty soon. I don't want to give too much of the carb backloading away. Like, I've read the book. I was pretty impressed with it. Now, Kiefer takes an approach that obviously is different than where I'm coming from, and that, like, when he recommends his carb feeds, it's like apple turnover, hit the Waffle House and destroy the place. It's
I already like him.
Yeah, it's pretty. He and Steve Payne would be a close.
Steve is doing carb backloading, front loading, center loading, top and bottom loading.
Top and bottom loading. Yeah. So the idea here, and it's the one thing that I will give away on this gig that I think is intriguing. Kiefer recommends that you do your training in the afternoon or heading towards evening, because we actually lose insulin sensitivity as the evening progresses. Like, in the morning, we tend to be very insulin sensitive, and then we lose insulin sensitivity as the evening goes on. Historically, that's caused people to recommend that you should eat carbs earlier in the day because you're more insulin sensitive. But
is that increased sensitivity, though, simply the product of having fasted for 8 hours, or is there something else going on?
There's some legit, part of it is the fact that you fasted, but there's some legit, but I think some of it is just that we are typically more active. And so the muscles and the adipocytes are a little bit more primed towards, receiving nutrients. And also kind of the other side of that is that you can pull nutrients out a little bit better in a insulin sensitive state. So, burning off of stored fuel sources is in fact a little bit easier typically. And the observation that he made, though, is that post workout, particularly with resistance training, we have a period of time in which we have non-insulin mediated glucose transport. We have a period of time in which the muscles become saying insulin sensitive is actually a misnomer. I tend to say that because it kind of gets the same idea across. But the point is that the ability for the muscles to uptake glucose is via a non-insulin mediated route. And so he had this idea that you would lift weights late in the afternoon, late afternoon, early evening, and then you start doing carbohydrate loading in that period. And the idea would be that your adipocytes, your fat cells, would be insulin resistant because of the time of day, but then you figure out a way of flying nutrients into your muscles by not using insulin, by using this other method which circumvents the insulin mediated effects. And it makes sense. Like it makes sense. And so what he recommends is a basically kind of almost an intermittent fasting, cyclic low carb, where you eat sparingly, if at all, during the, for breakfast. And if you do eat, it's protein and fat, like it's kind of a ketogenic mix. And you do the same thing for lunch. And then for your evening meals, you put the vast majority of your calories in the evening, post-workout, and you eat a just shit ton of carbs with it. And he doesn't really put any... He likes the more insulin spiking, the more refined, the better for him. And part of the idea with that is that you want to shuttle all these nutrients into the cells as quickly as you can, and then you want the blood sugar levels to come back down to normal. If you were to eat slow-releasing carbs like beans or something like that, that you would end up with high blood glucose levels late into the evening. That would suppress growth hormone production, and that would be problematic. And, just looking at it from the outside, it makes sense. Like, and he's got some pretty impressive testimonials. And, there's just been a lot of stuff floating around out there. Like, it doesn't look super far off of like the warrior diet in some ways. Martin Burkham has tinkered with the whole lean gains, intermittent fasting gig.
Bulletin has recommended sort of a setup like that before too.
Yeah.
Super low carb throughout the day, and then after your final workout, doing a big carb load
for your final gig. Yeah. And Kiefer breaks some stuff down. Like, if you work out early in the day, then you do this protocol. If you work out midday, it's actually kind of the least optimum for a variety of reasons, which he goes into, which is kind of a bummer because that's when I tend to do jiu-jitsu and stuff like that. But it's pretty interesting. And Kiefer's got like a master's in physics and really knows his endocrinology quite well. And I think that you could easily find some high glycemic index, paleo carb type stuff so that we're not dealing with the gut irritation side of this. And I think that you could make a pretty good run at things. He also recommends some shakes, which you basically put together on your own, and you use some lysine and you do some hydrolyzed whey protein isolate, and he has some specific reasons for why you want to do those, both for like anabolic signaling and also enhancing insulin release and stuff like that. And I think there's probably some pretty good science to it. He lays out a pretty convincing argument, and for me, because I'm training usually midday doing jiu-jitsu, I haven't been able to tinker with this quite to the protocol that he likes. Like, he just likes people lifting weights, and if they do any type of aerobic activity, just doing some anaerobic intervals, like a 4-to-1, 5-to-1 work to rest ratio, and basically just likes people lifting weights and getting big, strong, and jacked, and which I can't really argue with that. That's kind of my wheelhouse too. If I had some preferences on it, jiu-jitsu being kind of the only deviation from that's a little bit more on the aerobic pathway, I guess, and non-resistance training. But I think it's really interesting stuff. Definitely going to get him on here. Going to be able to ask him a lot of questions, and I think, whether we're talking like a health and longevity standpoint, like I wrote some old stuff for the P menu, which I really still feel like is still some of my better writing on intermittent fasting and on hormesis and all that sort of stuff. And I think there's a really great argument for kind of nutrient cycling. And this is the stuff that always made me just lose my mind about the zone. Life seems to work in punctuated, like non-equilibrium based endeavors. Like you don't train at the same rate every day all the time. You fluctuate volume and intensity, and that's the way that people make the best progress. And when we look at metabolic flexibility and the benefit of switching back and forth between carbohydrate and fat as a fuel source, intermittently going into ketosis, having a hormetic stressor of a large carbohydrate load in a punctuated fashion, all of these things make sense. We still don't have enough information to say unequivocally that they are like the best way that you could go about doing things. But there's some good, there's some good mechanistic science that we can make some educated guesses about, and then do a little bit of N=1 tinkering. And I think something that looks like the carb backloading, or just simply throwing the bulk of your carbs in your post-workout period, and making the carbohydrate feeding based on volume and intensity of exercise, that just seems to make sense. There's just a lot of good reason for that. And then in other meals, sticking a little bit more ketogenic, even consuming modest amounts of protein in that period with large amounts of MCT-rich products, medium chain triglyceride products like coconut, so that it gooshes you into ketosis. There's good reasoning for that. It seems to make some sense. And I think Kiefer had some insights as far as potential mechanisms that could improve these things, like the observation about if you train in the evening, your fat cells are still going to be insulin resistant, but we're going to be able to shuttle nutrients into the muscles via non-insulin mediated activity. There's some interesting stuff with that. That was a perspective or an observation that I've seen all the same literature, but didn't connect the dots in the same way. So he's definitely a sharp dude, and looking forward to having him on the show. I think that you could easily tinker the material to fit a little bit more paleo-esque. I would certainly tinker with the shake recommendations he makes, because he seems to put a lot of weight on the importance of like the leucine for mTOR signaling, and then these hydrolyzed proteins for insulin, also insulin signaling. So yeah, Greg, any thoughts on that? Have you heard? He's been really popular in the powerlifting scene. Like Elite FTX and stuff like that.
The whole thing has been super popular with the powerlifting crowd recently. So I haven't paid a ton of attention to it. Mainly because when I first started hearing about it, it didn't really strike me as being very different from kind of the basic stuff that a lot of people had been doing for a long time anyway, which was putting the bulk of their carbohydrate intake immediately post-workout. And so I guess I didn't really see a huge distinction between what he's recommending and kind of what these other folks have been doing. So it'll be interesting to get him on, because I'm sure he can explain exactly why this is different and a little bit more effective. So that'll be good. And I also want to talk to him about people who train in the morning unavoidably.
His deal, the ideal time to train in his scheme is afternoon or evening. Second best is morning. And then what you do is some of the post-workout shakes, one carb feeding that's not enormous, but then you slip back into kind of a ketogenic gig, and then you do the larger carb meal that evening. He made an interesting point, too, that the carb refeed is more based around what you will do for tomorrow's training, not so much that you're specifically recovering from today's training, because you're going to potentially have a fasted period, then a ketogenic period, and so you want to stick enough muscle glycogen in so that if you're looking ahead, looking at the next day's training, which then actually necessitates some sort of planning and stuff like that. And he definitely wasn't a fan of kind of randomized training, CrossFit type stuff in this template for a variety of reasons. But part of it in my mind is just that if you really don't know what you're going to be doing from day to day, then it makes it hard to really anticipate, well, how much carbs do I need to eat tonight to be ready to train for my stuff tomorrow? So
yes, it's very difficult to plan if you don't have a plan.
Indeed.
All right.
Details.
Paleo Solution.